Hello and welcome to this webinar around consolidating security with a focus on threat management. My name is Elliot Wendt. I'm an enterprise systems engineer at SentinelOne. We're going to spend the next 25 minutes or so talking about the concepts of why we need to consolidate and the solutions and approaches therein. And we're then going to go into a 20-minute demo to look at how we can achieve this with SentinelOne. Now, before we talk about the nuts and bolts of how we get to that solution, I want to talk about why we have this problem in the first place. Now, this is one of those slides that tries to simplify what is a very complex situation, so it appears to be arbitrary, but fundamentally it's presenting this general state of cybersecurity today. Whether you are a multinational corporate with hundreds of analysts in a SOC, or if you are a single FTE public sector organization trying to secure that organization, effectively this is the threat landscape and the challenge that it's posing. And this means effectively the tools that we're spending money on, they can't objectively keep pace with the different types of threats we're dealing with. This is a fact. It's not something that is an opinion. And it's not just because of the proliferation of advanced threats that we have this problem. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But arguably, it's more so because of the different environments we're trying to protect, the different runtime environments, infrastructure environments, but also where those environments exist. So, if the technology as well can't keep pace and kind of scale to this challenge of threats that's changing, and it's the technology, unfortunately, that is overly reliant on a human skill set to gain value from, especially in those kind of in the context of those quite sophisticated threats. It's kind of driving this increase in inefficiency to deal with threats, and it's that increasing threat efficiency gap which is ultimately at the heart of why we are where we are today, where we are scrambling to find more solutions for more problems. And it's that what we're going to look at today and how we can reduce that threat efficiency gap. Now, I'm sure this isn't kind of revolutionary to anyone in the room. I think this concept is probably fairly well established at this point in the virtual room, I should say. But let's have a look at the historical context, I guess, of enterprise cybersecurity. Now, just like everything in the modern age, the pace of change when it comes to the threat landscape has exponentially increased throughout the last few decades. If we kind of think about the TJ Maxx attacks back in 2007, they were quite a sophisticated attack for the time, but it was somewhat of an outlier. The threat actors had to undertake quite a lot of effort to target that organization. So most boards at that time, they probably wouldn't have signed off on doubling security spend because of a few outlier incidents. But the reality is that today, the attacks that utilize those types of sophisticated techniques and far more complex techniques and behaviors that are rapidly changing, those are kind of the baseline today. And they happen with an absurd amount of frequency comparatively to back then. So this timeline doesn't really even take into account what's happened over the last few years as well. From 2018, you think of some of the examples more recently, like SolarWinds, Log4j, Print Nightmare. Those are just some of the more recent examples that spring to mind that I know have had security teams scrambling to respond to, but ultimately have left them looking to the market to try and figure out how they can best spend every dollar they have to protect the environment from future threats, which they cannot anticipate, such as those vulnerabilities and exploits. So if we look at this from the angle of kind of technology and how we've progressed over the years, we've kind of progressed from having preventative controls that give enough protection of the majority of likely threats. You had kind of commoditized threats like malware, and for outlier events, there were instant response services that were on a retainer where possible, and it was kind of good enough. There wasn't really an underground economy like there is today. There were just groups of tech-savvy hackers who were targeting organizations off their own back. So in more recent years, the cyber criminal economy has kind of flourished, and cyber criminal enterprises have added this like capitalist fuel to the fire. There's money to be made now, and there's money to be made by anyone who wants to accept a little bit of risk, put a bit of cash down. They can target an organization or an individual. They don't need a bunch of experience. And threat actors now, largely are organized criminal enterprises, genuine enterprises. They're well funded, right? They are taking the collateral of nation state techniques and threats, and they have their own development houses internally. They even have support functions for subscriptions. So we're kind of blurring the lines now between what was petty crime, someone trying to send a terribly crafted phishing email, and what is now nation state tools, tactics, and procedures. And that is becoming the de facto as there are more of these types of sophisticated threats. And cyber criminal warfare between nation states is becoming more of a thing. So these threats, they're becoming harder to catalog basically compared to those traditional threats we had to deal with. Then they're evolving so rapidly, right? We can't just take a signature or build a rule or even create some kind of heuristics engine that takes known patterns. Defenses have now evolved more towards visibility because of this, in order to hunt, detect, respond where possible. So there's new technologies like SIEMs, like SOARs, obviously EDR capability. These kind of areas where there is obviously a reliance on a human to go and unearth where there could potentially be suspicious or malicious activity. So the problem with this is, firstly, this progression relies, like I said, far more on skilled humans to get to this more proactive or higher fidelity detection capability in the vast majority of cases. Secondly, we're still only really talking about dealing with traditional compute environments like workstations and servers. And then thirdly, even within this fairly narrow definition of use cases, there's usually numerous technologies alone to meet even sometimes a basic practice of threat management, like responding to something as simple as a blocking of malware based on reputation, let alone anything that could actually action the smallest compromise. And all of this is to say, this is the progression of over decades. Exponentially in the last few years, the problem has increased, and the progression of technology that we're seeing here does not scale to the problem. It absolutely does not scale, as was referenced in that initial slide. So to talk about the solution, we kind of have to frame what the problem is. So let's just try and see the forest for the trees for a second. So as we saw in the previous slide, technologies have been developed and marketed largely around what are and were absolutely relevant and topical solutions and challenges at the time, but they are ultimately separate functions. And if we can strip back some of these preconceptions based on existing market-defined technologies, we can try and understand what it is we're trying to actually achieve with the sum of all of these technologies that are covering multiple use cases. Now, from a security perspective, every organization exists in one of three states. It's going to be in a pre-incident, where you're kind of minimizing risk, you're applying control technologies and policies, and those are relevant, obviously, to the overall aspect of threat management as well. And you've got your kind of post-incident, which is where you're learning from and improving, your security posture based on that feedback loop from an incident. But it's really the peri-incident timeline, which is where the rubber meets the road. It's where all the investments you've made should be providing that capability to protect the estate and reduce any ability for that threat to impact the business. So it's really where any security event should be as small and inconsequential as possible, whether it is blocking some basic malware, or if you're detecting it halfway through the kill chain, or if you're responding to a full-blown breach, whatever it is that wherever you're detecting at in your organization, whatever control, perimeter, endpoint, somewhere in between network, it should be as small as inconsequential as possible, that threat and response. So all of these scenarios that I just mentioned, they're part of the same problem, and that's usually where there's any number of technology at different points in that process and for different areas of the environment. Again, more commonly these days, it's not the use cases you're trying to meet, it's where you can meet those use cases across the environments that you're protecting. So really, it's defining, what is this spectrum of use cases in a nutshell that we've been addressing with multiple technologies, and that is what I say is really defined as threat management. So let me just zoom in and give you an example of this, a more tangible example on just one part of this process. If we think about dealing with a threat, dealing with that incident, you're going to go from the initial identification and blocking to containment to responding to cleanup and recovery. Arguably, the most important aspect of any incident, any threat you're dealing with, is the time it takes to contain that threat. And this process occurs constantly in most security environments, and it can originate from any number of tools or aggregation points. I'm talking agnostically from a vendor perspective for now, and we'll look at how SentinelOne deals with these types of issues in a minute. But from T0 here, which is where the security event actually occurs, you're going to obviously have a control or a function that detects that, hopefully, and flags that, and hopefully based on policy takes some automatic response. And that's where the alert comes in, and this is where the human enters the frame, right? If this was a simple block of a commoditized threat, then happy days. But if it's anything more than that, there is a process kind of to get to containment. The time to contain is really defining how big that security incident is going to be. So time to containment is absolutely critical for any security event, again, no matter how big or small. And more than likely, to get to go through the identification process to investigate that in order to take some manual response across multiple technologies, in order to verify the threat is indeed contained across all potential vectors that it might be trying to access your environment from. There's going to be multiple tools to get just to this T-contain stage. And depending on what tool this alert originated from, this could get very time consuming very quickly. And again, this is just to contain the threat. We haven't got to the point of talking about eradicating or recovering from that threat. And often the case is that with most environments, anything beyond that is generally seen as separate functions, separate technologies, but we really are dealing with the same problem here, which is to manage that threat end to end. Going back to market definitions, we haven't really had a cross-environment technology that meets the scale and the speed of the threat landscape challenge. And that's where the term XDR is now becoming interesting. Now, XDR is still a fluid concept depending on who you talk to, but really it's the end-to-end challenge that XDR is supposed to address, and it's supposed to do it in a way that can scale to the problem going forward. Now, I bet I know what you're thinking. Well, that's kind of seems, and that's what SOARs do, right? But they aren't solving the problem. We'll look at that more in a second. They aren't really reducing that threat efficiency gap that we saw on the first slide. XDR is a framing of the problem. So in that sense, it's an approach to the problem, but really it's underpinned by an innovation in technology that solves that problem. And that's a problem that there hasn't been a market for. As described here by Forrester, this is really what XDR is designed to do, and that is, as you saw on the previous slide, really addressing all of those use cases in a single platform. So XDR, depending on who you talk to, it can mean different things to different people, but it's really falling into two camps. You've got open XDR, which is an ecosystem play. It's multiple technologies were designed for different functions that were integrated together, and usually this is kind of wrapped in a service, and that's open XDR. Closed XDR is, like I say, this kind of the purest XDR, I suppose, which is this innovation in technology, and it's a platform capability. It's a technological solution because it's a technological challenge which we are not going to meet with multiple technologies that are already reliant on humans to meet this this challenge, which cannot be met by humans, right? So I'm going to dive a little bit more into what XDR isn't, and where these multiple technologies that we are currently using, we can consolidate if we're trying to meet that consolidation need for these advanced capabilities when it comes to really security efficacy across the estate. So XDR is not SIEM. SIEMs were born out of a need predominantly for log retention, and they had use cases which were capable to be built on over time. Started out really with governance and compliance, and there's rules-based pattern matching as well that were built in. There's heuristics such as UABA now. There's telemetry enrichment, etc. So there's lots of different capabilities that you can use a SIEM for, but fundamentally they're not meeting the challenge. You're right. They've always required huge amounts of human input because they weren't designed to do threat management as a function. As I say, they were really designed to ingest data and, dare I say, kind of ring a bell when something is matched based on the rule or the engine that you're applying over those logs. But B, logs are broad and shallow data sets. They are not great for high fidelity threat detection. I can say this, I've worked at many SIEM vendors, and I still do work with SIEM vendors, and the SIEMs they have solid use cases which need to be met in organizations, but it's not, again, addressing that threat inefficiency gap. And so the other thing about logs, of course, is that they're detecting known events. They're detecting known events from sources, and they're being brought in, correlated, and then generating something on, right? And that's detecting known events, and it's detecting known events that aren't in proximity to where the actual events are occurring and where the damage is occurring. So it's after the fact, so it's slow, it's inefficient, it's reliant on prior knowledge, and of course it requires, because of this, constant feeding and watering, and is usually very inefficient in detecting nuanced threats that you have no prior knowledge of. So it's not going to really generate kind of high fidelity data we're talking about if we're trying to meet that challenge of the threat efficiency gap and the scale and the spectrum of challenges in the um, threat management definition. Now, similarly, let's look at SOARs. Again, another technology which, and these two usually are defined as XDR together, and they are often used as, the next step in your capability to do threat management really well. Well, SOARs have firstly never really been accessible for anyone except the more mature end of the security organization scale, and even then they are also hard to get value from when you do have lots of humans, FTEs, skill sets to kind of throw at the problem. But even then, the integrations that you build for that SOAR, they're an effort to get stood up, but you have to maintain those integration playbooks, and workflows they're kind of a never-ending project. If there's a change to your internal systems, or there's even a change to external threats or vulnerabilities, chances are you've got to change that playbook. And again, it's not really scaling to the speed and the problem that's being faced by that organization from a threat landscape perspective. So similar to SIEMs, they're not redundant. I'm not saying that. SOARs absolutely have a place in the security ecosystem, even at the heart of the security ecosystem. And the art of the possible with SOARs is just never ending, right? But they're not delivering on the vision they were designed for and cutting to the heart of the problem, which is to reduce the overhead of the human, whilst allowing that security technology ecosystem to evolve with the threat landscape. Now, I've picked on two prevalent technologies there because they're most typically what I'm seeing as marketed as XDR, but also, because they are often seen as being, the next state of higher capability when it comes to managing threats. But I would call that open XDR, as I say, because it involves ecosystem of technologies to meet that fundamental criteria of detecting and responding to threats. But that concept that I mentioned there about human reliance and relying on prior knowledge and chasing the problem, that goes for all technologies that are reliant on the humans to kind of do that stuff, right? So when we talk about what XDR is, and I'm talking about a pretty ambitious challenge here, right? If I'm saying all this stuff about how they aren't meeting XDR, I'm sure you're probably thinking, well, how do you, and why is SentinelOne any different from those technologies? Well, it is a very ambitious challenge, of course, and it's always going to be a data problem. And we'll look at how we have been solving the data problem and what that really means under the hood in just a second. But if we're talking about the ability to extend detection and response from the perspective of what we currently know about where we don't have coverage and where we are not being quick enough to detect and respond to threats, then we can talk about EDR as being the fundamental bedrock of a good XDR, right? Because EDR, if you're going to look at one technology in your security ecosystem that will give you the highest capability to convict threats with precision, without creating loads of noise, but convict threats with precision as quickly as possible, it's going to be your EDR. And I will die on that hill, and I will argue that point, because EDR is on the box where the actual malicious events are occurring. If there's a human inputting commands in a remote shell session, and that's happening over the course of milliseconds, or someone's running a script on a device, the EDR has the ability to detect the most minor nuances that are occurring within process event life cycles from 1 millisecond to the next. And so the EDRs have your highest ability for conviction in that environment for whether something is definitely going to be suspicious or malicious versus if it's completely benign, without just creating an engine that just alerts on everything, right? So if you have the ability to do that, EDR is going to give you that because of the raw telemetry that is being ingested and analyzed, and in SentinelOne's case, doing that in real time on the box as the events occur. So that speed and conviction, that fidelity capability is the bedrock of what should be XDR, because at the end of the day, we're just taking that concept and extending beyond the endpoint, beyond traditional servers, workstations, Windows and Macs, let's say, or Linux, and extending the use cases you're delivering across that detection response capability, more than just detecting, something and saying respond by isolating the machine from the network. There's more to managing threats than just isolating a machine and re-imaging it, because that's not really recovery. And also doing all of this right while reducing the reliance on the human and reducing the barrier to entry to do this broad scope of capability, and broad scope of sophisticated detection and response, reducing that barrier to entry without diluting your capability to protect the estate from the most complex threats and attack scenarios. So XDR is to basically taking all the good stuff that we know about how EDR has been functioning for companies that are using EDR and extending that capability to cross-platform, cross-environment functions, right? And focusing on holistic threat management, detecting and responding to ensure the objectives are met across the security organization, and your outcomes in business resilience and maintaining security for that business is as high as possible, like again without huge amounts of resource and spend. So that's SentinelOne's really our kind of growth into XDR, and it is an organic growth because this is how we've always been functioning on the box. And I'm going to show you this in a demo in just a second. And it's how we can consolidate, like I say, multiple technologies for any use case, because the way that we function on the box is a patented function of our agnostic agent. I should say OS agnostic agent. This agent was built from the ground up and designed with that broader capability in mind, right? We weren't building a use case specifically for preventing malware and then we designed a behavioral engine or a data modeling capability afterwards. This is our agnostic of operating system, Windows, Linux, Mac, mobile devices, containers, immutable infrastructure, IoT. It's designed to do this wherever we have a presence. And what it does is basically for every process that's running in that runtime environment that we have a presence on, we are ingesting events in processes life cycles in real time and mapping them into a sequence in real time. So everything is being mapped and interpreted basically as a human would try and interpret it, but constantly for every minute event that's occurring. So if you're proactively asking questions of your estate, like who opened this file in the last few days, or who went to this URL, or who interacted with that system, you always have context of what happened leading up to it and what happened afterwards. And within these sequences, we are building MITRE behaviors in at every step, whether it's completely benign or malicious. If you're just purely for visibility perspective, you will always have context for any given event or events that you're looking at, and you will always have that MITRE enrichment to understand it in plain English. It's doing that triage interpretation of complex environments for you, so when you need to get the answer, you know it immediately. So we do this constantly all the time. We do it at machine speed on the box. This is not after the fact. Everything is pre-processed. So if something is marked and convicted as bad, whether it's a bit of malware that's being downloaded and immediately killed, or if it's something more nuanced that is interacting with the environment and is changing registry settings or something like that, so modifying files, right? If it's allowed to do anything basically in an environment, whether it's based on the policy you've set or if it's just because it is that nuanced that it's doing things under the radar, SentinelOne isn't infallible, right? No, as is no technology vendor. But if anything is flagged is tarnished before SentinelOne gets to it, we are providing you with a complete catalog of everything in that environment was tarnished, both on that machine and any other tarnished machines. So any runtime environment that's affected will tell you not only what was tarnished, but the root cause of that. So as an analyst, you have an immediate interpretation. You know what machines are affected. You know what the impact of that is and if it's an active threat. And you know exactly what you need to do about it, because you can take that entire catalog of all impacted machines. Of course, you can contain that threat immediately, but crucially, you can completely unroot that threat. You can eradicate it, and you can even recover those machines that were impacted. Even if it's, say, something like ransomware, we can, in most cases, there are always going to be caveats around some of these things, but in most cases, we can even restore files that have been damaged or encrypted as part of ransomware, right? So it's having that ability to not just say, all right, we've seen something bad and we've taken an immediate action. Let's throw it over to IT to now re-image 500 machines. It's giving that ability to, without disrupting users, in one click, without rebooting, re-image machines, in one click, restore the environment back to its normal operations. That's kind of the concept that we've been applying for years now and has been proven out in things like the MITRE testing, and the most recent one we see here in front of us, which is the capability not just to detect the most, having the highest coverage of visibility across the campaign level attack scenario that they ran, but actually reducing that into the least amount of interpretation and actions needed for an analyst to completely recover from that threat, again, without any disruption to the environment. So for context, we got the most amount of visibility with one other vendor in terms of the amount of detection capability across all of the steps of that campaign level attack. However, the other vendor got nearly 50 alerts on the output. We created 9 alerts. So we are doing the interpretation, we're doing that data modeling in real time to present the least amount of interpretation and the easiest, swift, comprehensive, holistic response across all affected areas of the estate. So that concept of storyline is basically what we're extending into the areas of the estate where we don't have that kind of agent on the runtime environment, and taking action across areas of the estate which we don't have an agent embedded on the environment. And it's that we'll kind of have a glimpse at in a minute, but it's the consolidation of what is effectively, either the kind of commoditized fodder of day-to-day alerts that are coming into the console to ensure that you're not wasting time, analysts having to triage, investigate, interpret anything that's going on. And if something does appear to be something that is a live threat, if you are taking an action comprehensively to protect your estate, both on the devices where we have an agent present, even where we don't, if those are AD response actions we're taking to manage the user's password, if we are changing email gateway information, if we are stepping up authentication, if we're implementing firewall changes, those are one-click, no-code response actions that you are taking comprehensively on any single threat that you see in the SentinelOne console. And again, based on that data modeling capability, we're not relying on prior knowledge of a threat, so we are detecting and providing information about even those threats which could be supply chain, zero-day, never before seen type of nation-state tools, tactics, and procedures, without the need to build lots of comprehensive workflows and playbooks to respond to them. So that's the XDR story. That's the threat management kind of consolidation story that SentinelOne has, and it's like I say, an approach as well as a technology. And I'm going to show you that in the flesh now and kind of show you what that looks like. So we're going to go through a bit of a demo now of the platform, and we're going to look at some of the concepts that we talked about the last 20 minutes or so. And this is our SentinelOne console, effectively. Everything is managed from this console, whether it is the traditional prevention capability, the more advanced EDR function, some of the supplementary functions we haven't talked about today, such as IoT and asset inventory and risk management. These all form part of that capability, right, of general threat management and hygiene, visibility of areas of the estate you might not have known about or not have reach into, for example, form part of our Ranger function here. But we're really going to focus on what is, like I say, the bedrock of our consolidation capability, which is the fact we are data modeling across endpoints and across non-runtime environments, which is that XDR function of ingestion of third-party information from other areas of the estate, AD, identity, etc., and responding across other areas of your estate to those high-fidelity detections. So we're going to go through an actual threat demo, and we're going to see that evolve. But just before I do, just to highlight, I guess, some of the elements of consolidation which SentinelOne provides here. This is our kind of endpoint management section where we can see all the different agents or sentinels deployed across all of the different sites we have in our account here. And the point I want to raise here is that we effectively see all the runtime environments as just another endpoint. If you're thinking from a traditional endpoint security perspective of those use cases of EPP, EDR, control, etc., it's just another endpoint to us. Desktop, laptop, Kubernetes machine, storage. Same goes for mobile, same goes for legacy operating systems, right? So it's not just about saying we tick that box, but having feature parity and coverage across all of the operating system versions that we have in those runtime environments that we're protecting. And that's something SentinelOne's always been quite good at, because again, we don't have heaps of technical debt. We're quite a young company, so we can provide that agnostic security capability across all those areas of the estate. So I'm going to go into my site, my demo site in this demo account here, and I can see I've got a number of different groups for various reasons, both operating system allocation as well as things like the high-risk machines. But in this case, we're going to focus on my Windows Workstation group, and I'm going to compromise this Windows 10 machine, and I'll show you the responsive actions we have on a fileless type of attack, right, that has done some real damage, and how the approach to consolidating that threat management lifecycle allows us to, have this organic mechanism in the agent that presents to the human a pre-interpreted context, which can be actioned across all of those different use cases. And we'll then look at the XDR capability as well, which provides, like I say, that ability to do that action, but across more than just the endpoints. So to compromise this machine, if I just go into the instance section so we can see if an alert bubbles up, this is the Windows 10 machine here I'm going to compromise, and I've got over here a Linux box. Don't worry too much about what's happening on this box. This is just representative of a command and control server. And I say representative, it is a command and control server. So this is effectively the replication of an APT29 style attack, which is a Russian threat actor group. And their modus operandi is generally sending very well crafted phishing emails or some kind of hook to get a user to click on a link, or it's very well crafted and typically very highly targeted to compromise an endpoint, usually using some kind of fileless exploit. And that's exactly what's happening here. So on the Windows 10 box, we have a Word document, and it's just a Word document, right? There's no malware necessarily in this case. We would have inspected this Word document before it was dropped on the machine. So or at least as it was dropped on the machine. So as someone opened a Word document, email, let's say, or they plugged in a USB drive and copied the file, or they downloaded it from Chrome, whatever the vector, SentinelOne's detection capability is ubiquitous on that machine, and like I say, it's machine speed. So we analyze the file reputationally and statically before it's executed. Of course, behaviorally as well, we monitor everything as it happens. But in this case, this Word document statically is just sitting there with no code executing, and there's nothing objectively odd about it. It just has a macro in it. So when the Word document opens and that macro runs, it only takes a millisecond or two. But it runs a couple of events on that machine, which, when executed, are convicted, as you can see, by SentinelOne. So we've detected that there is a suspicious or malicious activity on that machine based on when the macro ran. Now, we are letting this threat exist on the machine because the policy I've set in SentinelOne is set to detect only mode. We can see in the console, we'll have an alert pop up here for that behavioral threat, and the policy we have set is to detect only, and that means that basically we are using all of the static and dynamic, the reputational, the behavioral engines, the real-time command line session monitoring action, all those algorithmic determinations are continuously running. They're just not set to policy kill a threat, right? So if something's detected based on policy, it's set to allow that threat to run. Otherwise, we would have killed it immediately, and that would be the end of this demo. But I do want to show you some of the more consolidated capabilities in what would be a typically sprawling threat, which would require lots of different technologies to respond to. So in this case, we're kind of at the very start of the attack, and all we've done at this point, we go back to our machine here, we've got a session established from our command and control, but nothing bad has really happened yet. They've just got a hook into the environment. So they're going to go through a number of stages now throughout this attack to basically get their hooks in, probably laterally move across the environment, and ultimately do some damage and monetize the attack, right? That's the whole point of these types of attack, is usually to get to the point of running ransomware or something like that. So as we go through the stages of the attack, and I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, I've scripted this for speed, so usually this would happen over the course of maybe hours, if not days, and generally it wouldn't be compromising one machine, it would be compromising a bunch of machines. So this is, for the sake of speed, obviously scripted and affecting a single machine, but nonetheless, the attack kill chain we're going through would be the same in a real world scenario. So right now we're getting around, we're migrating away from that initial process to get initial privilege on that machine, so that when I close Word, for example, as a user, we're still maintaining access into that environment. So that's kind of effectively like building in a backdoor into that environment. And this would typically happen, once they've laterally moved to other machines, they would also do the same thing. They'd create multiple entry points and vectors into that environment. So as we're going through these phases, and I'm now trying to get around user account control so I can get privilege escalation, because to do anything on any box, right, you need to get privileges. And it's all about detecting that threat before it can get to that point. So if we go back to our threat overview screen here, or our alert, if you want to call it that, then you can see that there are all of these stages of the attack. They are being aggregated into this single alert. And that's because, remember, we have a storyline associated with every single event. Every single minute event or sequence will have a unique referenceable ID. So that's why if this threat starts to low and slow work its way through the environment, you'll still only have one alert to reference based on the fact that it's all tagged within this storyline. And we can see as we go through the attack that these behaviors, these MITRE behaviors and categorizations through each stage of that kill chain will be appended to this single reference point. So at the moment, it's only on one endpoint, as we can see here, right? So it's one endpoint that's affected, but we could easily see that it starts to move across endpoints. We can see that those behaviors will build across, let's say, 2, 3, 4, 5 endpoints, right? So we're going to continue to work our way through this attack. And the thing I want to highlight here is obviously, again, right, we're running in detect only mode. So just bear that in mind. Otherwise, this threat would never get off the ground in the first place. But as we're working our way through that system, we're building our way, we're burrowing further into the machine to try and get to the point to do damage. SentinelOne's detection capability, remember, is, to my earlier point around data modeling, your ability to convict genuine malicious events is only as good as your visibility in proximity to where those events are occurring. And that's why SentinelOne's logic is all on the box. So not only would we have killed this threat if it was completely off the network with no network connection to the console, but equally we would have done that at machine speed on the box as well, right? So we would have killed it if it was completely isolated, because we're doing that on the box, and we would have killed it immediately as soon as Word opened. But of course, again, we're letting this threat execute. Now, what we've done here basically is we've worked our way through the attack kill chain, is done the damage, and we've destroyed some data. In most cases, to be honest, this would be something like running ransomware. And we have ransomware demos we can run all day long, but I wanted to prove the point that if we were to go to detect something like this, you don't want to detect it by the time ransomware is running. You want to detect it as soon as that threat enters the environment. And that's kind of what we're saying here, is that it's that earliest possible warning sign of which we would have detected, convicted, and stopped this threat based on those minute convictions within process lifecycle events on the device as soon as they're occurring. But let's say, for the sake of argument here, let's say ransomware has ran, and it's ran across 100, 200 machines, or even 1,000 machines. The output is effectively the same in this case. We have a Windows machine here, which is, the files have been damaged and it's effectively inoperable, right, from the sake of the user's perspective. And rather than, say, affecting one endpoint, perhaps this affects, hundreds, like I say. So that storyline would, provide us the ability to see all of this all of these behaviors that constitute this attack. So from an initial triage perspective, we've got a heap of information to make a pretty quick determination that actually this Word document should really not be doing all this stuff. You don't have to be a skilled analyst to make that determination. But if we want to triage even further, we can, pivot into VirusTotal and see if there's any reputation on this, for example. Of course, there isn't, because it's a fileless crafted attack for this specific scenario. And if we need to, we can go into the visualize view to see what actually happened throughout that storyline. And we can even go into the individual telemetry down here as well to see the file modification events, the IP connection events, and all this kind of good stuff. And this is effectively, now this is, what is showing you the actual interpretation of those sequence of events as a human would interpret them. That's the storyline's job, is not just to present a binary linear view of process interactions, because that won't really tell you the actual process of events. It will show you a linear kind of one-to-one memory to disk mapping. This is trying to show you within and across processes what actually happened when Word opened and the child processes it spawned across multiple processes here. I'm not going to go through all this, but effectively we can see, if this was affecting, however many machines, 10 machines, we could kind of go through this process and see what happened on those machines that, like I say, allowed the threat to firstly materialize in the environment, but secondly get its hooks in, and thirdly do all the damage, and exactly what it did along every single step of the way, including the files that it destroyed, how it made persistence through the registry changes. All of those are included in this catalog here, right? But really, you would have taken an action well before this to probably contain that threat and any other affected threats by taking either an isolation action to disconnect it from the machine. You would naturally, as soon as you saw this, probably add it to a blacklist, which would say, whilst this isn't a known reputational hash or file in the wild, now we are marking it as tarnished. We want to make sure that any other machine that has that file on it, whether it's been executed or not, as soon as it's seen on any device, immediately kill it, right? And of course, we would want to take some mitigation and response actions to comprehensively, like I say, not just contain the threat, but eradicate it. And I'm going to show you that in a second, but we're still talking here from an EDR perspective. These are EDR functions on the basis that everything I'm showing you is focused on, whilst it is consolidation of use cases across, again, across multiple areas of runtime environments. This same view, the same capability, the storyline, everything I'm showing you is capable across all of those runtime environments, Windows, Linux, Macs, containers, etc. So it's in consolidation in that perspective, but also we're doing far more in our response capability across those endpoints. However, this is still very endpoint centric, and I want to show you what the XDR consolidation function looks like. So I've got another alert here, which was an actual ransomware event. So it's a Conti ransomware which ran across a number of endpoints. So we've got 5 endpoints that are affected. But crucially, there are elements within this threat which, whilst convicted on a box with SentinelOne running on it, based on that high fidelity detection capability, we detected it, again, early warning sign, and we can see that the process user here is Jean-Luc. And the same goes for all these threats. We're pulling these indicators in, and we can grab these and we can go and hunt for them in EDR and see more information about that user and whatnot. But with XDR, what we're doing is pulling information in about any of the elements or indicators implicated in this threat, such as in the username here. We're then pulling information in from third-party sources, such as Okta in this case, or Zscaler, to find more information about this user, and are there any events about that user that also correlate to this threat. So that if we are taking an action on this threat that implicates that user in AD, and it implicates that user in, say, Mimecast, in their email gateway, and your firewalls, because there's an IP address maybe in this storyline somewhere, we can take an action across all of those areas to say, when I'm going to respond to this threat, I'm not just taking an action on that endpoint. All of the touch points, all of the vectors that threat actor could have tarnished, even outside of SentinelOne's presence, in your infrastructure, in your AD, in your Okta, etc. I'm going to make sure that all of those bases that could have been touched are that we are making sure that threat no longer has access through any vector. Suspend the user, right? Get them to step up authentication, expire their sessions, restrict what they have access to, etc. And these are just some examples of some of the XDR actions you would take, as well as all the recovery of all of the elements of ransom files that you want to recover and everything else that's covered in the 30,000 events that infected or allowed to compromise that machine, right? But in this case, I am going to respond to this one threat that I showed on the machine. I'm not going to take any XDR actions because there's a bit more time for that, and I'm short on time. So I'm just going to kill the affected processes, quarantine the affected file, remediate that system or all affected systems. In other words, surgically unroot that threat from all affected machines, and restore any files that were damaged or encrypted as part of that attack. And I could apply that to all instances. I'm not going to do that because it's a demo environment. I don't want to mess with anyone else's demo. But when I hit apply, it's basically working through that storyline, and it's going through the entire containment, eradication, and recovery lifecycle with one click. There's no other technology involved here. And this is, like I say, an organic function of the fact the storyline is inherently cataloging everything. So we can see that we've kicked that user out of multiple sessions. Again, if that had laterally moved across multiple areas of the estate and you're responding in one click, you're unrooting that threat from multiple areas and backdoors into your environment. We can see on the Windows 10 machine here, the files that were damaged or that were stolen, the deleted, have been restored. The same would go for encrypted files in that case. The actual culprit file on the desktop here is also gone, right? So we're not just taking a basic kill action or contain. We are fully recovering without any human intervention, without handing over to multiple different jurisdictions. Of course, there's elements of approval you'd probably want to build into this process, but nonetheless, it's a single agent, single console platform that provides comprehensive capability to like this and beyond. And of course, we can validate everything that was taken, all the actions, whether they are just EDR or XDR actions, through comprehensive reports to show you that that environment is in fact clean. And this isn't just a smoke and mirrors response capability. Naturally, you would want to then investigate this further and validate your environment is in fact clean. So we can see here, if we go into deep visibility, this is an XDR view of that previous threat I showed you, where we have all information across your estate correlated into this single view to say, well, we know based on that threat, here are all the other areas of the estate that have been implicated from that user that we picked up based on that threat. Active Directory information, Ativo, Zscaler, Okta, and more. So when we are taking an action, we already have that on a plate to say exactly where we need to take action across the estate, what infrastructure and what endpoints are affected. That's really the end of the XDR demo, or the threat management lifecycle demo. There's plenty more we could show you from consolidating perspective, like I say, around IoT and script orchestration and various other functions with SentinelOne when it comes to deception and identity as well, with our recent acquisition of Ativo. But this hopefully gives you an idea of how organically that storyline capability facilitates the consolidation of multiple different technologies, both across different areas of the environment and across different use cases that you're meeting with multiple technologies already. Hopefully you found that interesting, and please do let me know if you have any questions. My information will be provided following this session. Thanks very much.